Kody Brown was never just a man with 4 wives and a reality show. He was the architect of a belief system he used to build a brand, a family, a following, and an empire that crumbled under its own secrets. And if you look closely at every moment of joy, pain, and betrayal on Sister Wives, you'll see a trail of subtle clues pointing towards something much bigger than just family drama. You'll see the shadow of a 5th woman, a figure hidden in plain sight. Someone who wasn't just another spiritual flirtation, but a full-blown relationship that rewrites the story we've been told for over a decade, because the myth of Kody Brown has always been one of control disguised as faith, love marketed as equality, and polygamy romanticized as freedom, when in reality, it became a battlefield of favoritism, emotional manipulation, and deeply buried deception. And while millions tuned in to see how 4 women could share one man, what they were really watching was a slow unraveling of trust. As Kody's spiritual leadership quietly shifted from guiding his wives toward salvation to steering them away from the truth, a truth he buried beneath contracts, NDAs, production edits, and carefully worded family meetings. And it wasn't COVID or Christine's independence or Mary's loneliness that broke the family. Those were just symptoms, distractions, surface-level wounds meant to conceal the infection underneath. Because the real disease spreading through the Brown family was secrecy, and its patient zero may have been a woman named Elena, a woman the cameras never caught, the tabloids rarely mentioned, and the family refused to acknowledge, yet whose presence was felt in every missing piece of Kody's schedule, every strange financial transaction, every sudden shift in his theology. And according to a former crew member who worked on the set during the Flagstaff seasons, there were repeated concerns raised by producers about Kody's unexplained absences, his insistence on keeping certain weekends off limits, and his increasingly erratic behavior in interviews where he dodged questions with vague spiritual jargon and responded to inquiries about future wives with lines like, "God hasn't told me to stop," which in retrospect reads less like a hypothetical and more like a justification, and it was in this atmosphere of rising tension and deteriorating trust that Christine began privately journaling what she described as Kody's second reality, a term she used to explain moments where he would speak in riddles, disappear for hours, and return with a calmness she hadn't seen in years, a calmness that suggested he was no longer invested in fixing what they had, but instead found peace elsewhere. And one entry from late 2020 describes how Kody rejected an invitation to spend time with his kids on the grounds of spiritual cleansing. Yet that same day, a fan in southern Utah reported seeing him holding hands with a woman outside a retreat center known for closed-door fundamentalist teachings. And when confronted, Kody dismissed it as a look-alike, yet refused to provide an alibi or share where he had actually been, which further fueled Christine's suspicions and set off a chain of quiet investigations among the wives, each trying in their own way to verify where Kody was really going when he said he was working on the land or seeking revelation, and what they found wasn't proof in the traditional sense. No love letters, no selfies, no signed marriage certificates. But what they found were holes in the story big enough to swallow their faith, their future, and their belief that they were the only women bound to this man in covenant. Because while Robyn remained the closest to Kody on camera, even she began showing signs of stress, slipping in interviews, contradicting timelines, and at one point, whispering off camera to a producer, "If they find out, it's over," a clip that was never aired but was allegedly flagged during post-production by multiple editors as potentially explosive. And what exactly it was remains unclear. But sources close to the editing team claim that it followed a series of takes in which Robyn broke down in tears, not over the family tensions, but over something she couldn't say out loud, something that, according to her own words, wasn't my decision. And the more you dig, the more it becomes clear that Elena was not just another potential courtship, she was already integrated, spiritually sealed in a private ceremony that only a few were aware of, possibly as far back as 2017, when Kody began taking solo trips to attend private gatherings in off-grid locations where fundamentalist communities still practiced forms of polygamy more extreme than what was ever shown on Sister Wives. And while TLC remained willfully blind, perhaps out of fear of breaching contracts or triggering legal complications, the truth began leaking in subtle ways. Background figures blurred in drone footage, unexplained entries in family budgets, and even a moment in one episode where Kody's phone screen was visible for a fraction of a second, revealing a contact labeled Lonnie, a name that fans later connected to Elena after cross-referencing public marriage registries, online forums, and leaked screenshots from a private Facebook group tied to the Brown family's former congregation. And the pattern was undeniable. Where there was smoke, there wasn't just fire, there was an inferno of secrecy, deception, and manipulation. A parallel life being lived while the original family imploded for the world to see. And what makes this more disturbing isn't just that Kody may have secretly taken a fifth wife, but that he may have done so while gaslighting his entire family and exploiting the public's obsession with his dysfunction for profit. Because if this spiritual marriage to Elena occurred in secret, while his legal and spiritual obligations to the other wives remained intact on paper, it represents the ultimate betrayal, not just of trust, but of the very religious framework he used to justify polygamy in the first place. And for someone like Christine, who entered the family with idealism and deep belief in that system, the realization that Kody could circumvent the moral and emotional obligations of plural marriage in favor of secret monogamy with someone younger, more obedient, and more sheltered from public scrutiny was a devastating blow, one that reportedly accelerated her decision to leave. And when Janelle began asking direct questions, not just about the Elena rumors, but about irregularities in family finances and Kody's contributions to shared household costs, she allegedly received vague deflections, accusations of disloyalty, and even veiled threats that the family's financial security depended on discretion, a chilling phrase that stuck with her long after the conversation ended, especially once she discovered that multiple withdrawals had been made from joint accounts to fund property purchases that no wife had signed off on. And while Mary remained more emotionally isolated, perhaps due to years of being on the margins of Kody's affections, even she began to raise concerns about a ghost in the marriage, someone unnamed who was drawing Kody's attention away with such intensity that he no longer even pretended to maintain balance among the wives. And Robin, often seen as the favorite, became increasingly defensive, shifting from public denials to subtle evasions. And in one particular scene from season 17, when asked if she would support Kody taking another wife, she paused for a long moment, then said, "That's between him and God." A drastic shift from her previous stance that the family was complete, and many fans believe that pause was the moment she knew the question was no longer hypothetical, because by then, Elena wasn't a possibility, she was a fact. And not just a woman in the wings, but a wife in hiding, potentially living in a home purchased under an alias, possibly even with a child. A detail that began circulating in fan forums after a Flagstaff pediatrician's office was reportedly visited multiple times by a woman resembling Kody's secret companion, accompanied by a man described as looking like Kody in disguise. And while this could be speculation, it aligns with other sightings, including one from a delivery driver who claimed to have dropped off groceries at a rural address where the woman called herself Lonnie Brown. And though there is no official record of that name being tied to Kody, the circumstantial evidence continued to stack up. Matching vehicles, travel timelines, and statements from locals who said the man they saw always kept his head down and never gave a name. And when TLC producers were questioned about the possibility of an off-camera wife, they offered no comment, citing privacy and contractual limitations. But multiple former staffers have hinted at a major truth bomb that the network is terrified of revealing. Not because of moral outrage, but because of legal liability. Because if Kody married Elena spiritually, but failed to disclose that to the show or to his legal wife, Robin, it could constitute fraud under certain clauses in their talent agreements. And more importantly, it could collapse the entire narrative TLC has sold for over a decade. The idea that Sister Wives was ever about spiritual truth when it may have just been about spiritual spin. And this is what devastates the viewers who once believed in choice, in plural love, in a radical family model that, while controversial, was at least transparent in its struggle. Because now they are forced to reckon with the idea that everything they witnessed, every fight, every vow renewal, every tearful interview may have been staged to cover for the most traditional of betrayals. A man lying to his wives and the world to pursue a fantasy that didn't include them. And this fantasy, if true, paints Kody not as a failed husband, but as a manipulative architect, building a future not with his family, but in spite of them and Elena. Quiet, hidden, invisible to the audience but present in his life, becomes the symbol of that betrayal. The final secret he thought he could bury beneath the rubble of 4 broken marriages and a fractured family name. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this secret isn't just the lies or the betrayal, but the planning, the cold, methodical nature of how Kody may have orchestrated this entire deception over the course of years, carefully laying the groundwork through spiritual justifications, legal loopholes, and public misdirection, slowly alienating each of his original wives through favoritism and gaslighting until their departures seemed organic, even inevitable, while behind the curtain, he was already building something new, something hidden, something that aligned not with the progressive vision of polygamy he once preached, but with a far more insular, traditionalist ideology, and those who know him best have begun to speak out, not on the record, Not publicly, but quietly, through online leaks, anonymous tips, and cryptic statements made in private support groups where former members of similar polygamist sects have started drawing alarming comparisons between Kody's behavior and that of known patriarchal figures who use spiritual authority to manipulate, control, and isolate their families. And what emerges from these whispers is a picture of a man who may have been preparing for this shift all along, whose frustrations with being portrayed as a bumbling husband on national TV may have driven him to reclaim control in the only way he knew how, by abandoning transparency and returning to secrecy, by cutting off dissenting voices and surrounding himself only with obedience. And Elena, by all accounts, was the perfect candidate for that role. Reportedly raised in a conservative household, deeply faithful, and fully willing to embrace a private spiritual marriage without the legal mess or media attention. And perhaps that's why no official documents have surfaced. Because there are none. Because Kody learned from past legal scares, from the fallout of his move to Nevada and then Arizona, from the investigations into polygamy-related abuse in Utah, and he crafted this new relationship carefully, quietly, and entirely off the grid. A union sealed not by the state, but by whispered vows spoken in some secluded cabin or spiritual retreat, witnessed only by those willing to protect the secret at all costs. And while this may seem far-fetched to outsiders, those within the world of fundamentalist splinter groups know this story all too well. The charismatic male figure who loses faith in the system he built, then quietly replaces it with a shadow version, purged of dissent and built around control. And that control extends beyond just the marriage itself. It filters into how money is handled, how children are raised, how outside relationships are monitored or cut off. And already there are signs that Kody has adopted elements of this system, including his reported desire to homeschool again, his increasing rants about media intrusion, and his total breakdown in communication with his adult children who've chosen more independent lives. And it's in these patterns, the retreat, the isolation, the secrecy, that the truth begins to crystallize. Because when someone leaves a toxic system, they tend to run toward freedom. But when they create a new system in secret, while pretending the old one still exists, they're not escaping anything. They're rebuilding the same control under a new name. And what makes it even more heartbreaking is how this has affected the original wives, especially Christine and Janelle, who not only had to endure emotional abandonment, but also now face the reality that everything they fought for, every compromise, every sacrifice, was made irrelevant by a choice they weren't even allowed to know about. And viewers, who once rooted for this unconventional family to beat the odds, are now watching in horror as the story turns from an experiment in alternative love into a slow-motion collapse driven by ego, secrecy, and a hunger for power dressed up as revelation. And if the rumors are true, if Elena is not just a theory but a living, breathing wife with her own house, schedule, and possibly child, then the show can no longer claim to represent polygamy in any form other than deception, because what's being modeled is not plural marriage, but plural betrayal, and the silence from TLC speaks volumes. Because while the network profits from the implosion, it also shields itself from accountability, allowing Kody to continue spinning his version of the truth, while his wives, children, and even fans are left to piece together the real story through fragments, contradictions, and hidden clues. And what's even more twisted is how Kody has managed to maintain the illusion of legitimacy throughout this unraveling, using the very tools that once helped him build trust, faith, family, and production edits, to instead obscure, distract, and deflect, keeping just enough of the old narrative alive to keep viewers guessing. Just enough grieving husband energy on camera to mask the growing web of off-screen lies. And nowhere is this more visible than in his interactions with the remaining family members, especially Robin, who went from tearfully defending polygamy to nervously dodging questions about the future. And while she continues to frame Kody as misunderstood or overwhelmed, there's a noticeable shift in her body language. Her eyes darting during interviews, her voice tightening when certain topics arise, suggesting that she too may be trapped in a situation she didn't fully sign up for, a secondhand witness to a plan she can't control. And perhaps this is why she clings so tightly to Kody, even as his credibility erodes. Because the alternative is admitting that she was not the final wife after all, that she was used as a stepping stone to something even more secretive. And that realization may be too devastating for someone who built her entire adult life around being the obedient one. And meanwhile, Christine and Janelle are finally speaking freely. And while they haven't confirmed the Alana theory outright, their recent interviews are full of charged language, talk of being replaced, emotionally, of betrayals they can't speak about yet, and of watching someone they trusted turn into a stranger. And for longtime fans, these aren't just vague feelings. They're red flags, echoes of countless cult survivors who've described the moment they realized their leader no longer cared about their humanity, only their compliance, and with Mary now separated completely, Christine building a new life, and Janelle openly critical of Kody's behavior, the original foundation has fully collapsed, leaving only one question unanswered. Who exactly is Elena, and why has she remained invisible all this time? And the answer may lie in the way Kody has structured his current lifestyle. Far fewer public appearances, minimal interaction with the press, a sharp decline in family events shown on social media, and according to a recent investigation by online sleuths, a string of real estate transfers linked to companies associated with fringe religious groups, suggesting that Kody may have begun financially isolating himself from his past in order to create a new life that cannot be traced back to the sister wives' legacy. And if that's true, if he is indeed rebuilding his life in secrecy with Elena, then what we're witnessing isn't just the end of a reality show family, it's the erasure of an entire chapter of his life. The systematic deletion of inconvenient truths and painful attachments so that he can start again without explanation, without guilt, and without accountability. And while fans continue debating whether Alana exists, whether she's a wife or just a rumor, the weight of evidence leans increasingly toward truth. Not tabloid truth, but lived truth, the kind that's felt more than seen, the kind that explains why a man would slowly withdraw from every emotional obligation except one. Why he'd give up national fame and family unity in exchange for total control over a relationship that lives off the grid, free from scrutiny, free from rules, and fully under his direction. And in that space, quiet, hidden, isolated, Kody has become something else entirely. No longer a husband juggling love and fairness, but a patriarch reclaiming dominance over the chaos he blames everyone but himself for creating. And as this transformation becomes clearer, the heartbreak grows sharper. Because what once looked like a family navigating the complexities of plural love now appears to have been a slow-motion unraveling orchestrated by a man who never fully believed in the balance he preached. A man who leveraged religion when it suited him and discarded it when it no longer gave him the control he craved. And Elena, hidden from cameras, shielded from criticism, protected by the very silence that once bound his wives to obedience, is both the consequence and the reward of that control. And while the world watched the implosion of sister wives through the lens of drama and dysfunction, what they missed was the deeper tragedy that a family built on shared sacrifice was slowly hollowed out by one man's obsession with authority, and that the love once spread among 4 women was quietly consolidated into one secret relationship hidden from the people who deserved to know the truth most: his wives, his children, and the millions who once believed that even unconventional love could still be honest. And now, with Robin visibly unraveling under the pressure, with Christine and Janelle reclaiming their voices, and with Mary finally stepping away from the ghost of a marriage that had long since ended, the only thread still connecting Kody to his past is the truth he refuses to admit. Because admitting it would mean destroying the last remnants of a brand, a faith and a persona that he spent his adult life carefully crafting, and yet the evidence refuses to stay buried. From blurry fan photos and Reddit deep dives to leaked voice memos and anonymous tips, the story is coming together piece by piece, and with each revelation, the 5th wife is no longer a theory, no longer a whisper, no longer just an internet rumor. She is a reckoning, a mirror reflecting back everything Kody tried to hide beneath sermons and sound bites. And while he may never confess, while TLC may never air it, while Elena may never speak out, the truth has already taken root in the minds of the viewers who watched the cracks form, who saw the tears behind the smiles, who felt the shift when love turned to loyalty. Then loyalty turned to fear, and fear turned into silence. And now, in the ruins of what once was the most famous plural family in America, we are left with the pieces. Some on film, some off screen, some too painful to name, but all pointing to one undeniable reality. The story of sister wives was never just about polygamy, it was about power. And the hidden wife was never just a woman, she was the moment the illusion shattered. The proof that behind every carefully edited episode was a man who had already moved on, already made his choice, and already begun the next chapter of his life before the final. Credits ever rolled? The dust hadn't yet settled from the implosion of Kody's carefully constructed reality when the real consequences of his secret spiritual marriage began to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. Because the fallout wasn't just about broken relationships, it was about identity, inheritance, faith, and betrayal on a scale so intimate and deeply rooted that the effects reached far beyond his 4 public wives, shaking the foundation of an entire family dynamic that for years had been held together by fear. silence, and a shared belief in something greater than themselves. And now, with that belief burned to ash by the revelation of a fifth wife kept hidden from them all, every member of the Brown family was forced to confront a devastating question. Had they ever really known Kody at all? And if not, who exactly had they been following, trusting, building their lives around? Because for Mary, the pain wasn't just that Kody had moved on. It was that he had already done so years before, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, while still expecting her to smile through the cameras and serve as a placeholder in a role he no longer respected. And her cryptic posts became less cryptic as time passed, shifting from veiled sadness to sharp, pointed truths. As she spoke of letting go of illusions, of shedding skins, of no longer participating in lies dressed up as divine order. And for Christine, the betrayal was layered with bitter irony, because she had been the one to hold up the banner of faith for so long, to sacrifice comfort, validation, and intimacy in the name of a principle that Kody himself had clearly abandoned. And her exit became more than just a personal rebellion. It became a revolution, inspiring not just Janelle but countless women watching who had silently accepted less than they deserved under the illusion of religious duty. And Janelle, practical and fiercely intelligent, began not only separating herself emotionally but also legally and financially, digging into accounts, contracts, and joint assets that now looked more like traps than tools of unity. And what she found confirmed her worst fears: property purchased under shell companies, transactions masked with spiritual language, and a growing trail of evidence pointing toward the existence of someone else. Someone who wasn't just a distraction, but a fully integrated part of Kody's life, operating in secrecy while the rest of the family fought over crumbs. And this woman, Elena, whether her name was real or spiritual or entirely invented, began to take on shape not through confession, but through patterns. The missing weekends, the lies about land development, the vehicles spotted in rural corners of Arizona and Utah, the fan photos, the production edits, and the increasing anxiety in Robyn's eyes whenever Kody was mentioned in a context she couldn't control. And Robyn, once so composed, so confident in her place as the last wife, began unraveling on screen and off, her carefully manicured narrative slipping through her fingers like sand. And perhaps the most haunting part was the silence. Kody's refusal to directly address the rumors, to confront the growing pressure, to offer any clarity to the family or the audience that had followed them for more than a decade. Because in his silence, he spoke volumes, revealing a man who no longer saw the need to answer to the very system he once enforced. And as the older children began speaking out, not just in interviews but in raw, unfiltered social posts, it became clear that this wasn't just a story about wives, it was a story about children left behind, about sons and daughters grappling with abandonment, about generational trauma passed down under the guise of spiritual duty. And some of them admitted they hadn't spoken to Kody in months, even years, not because they had turned away, but because he had chosen his own path, a path so narrow and secretive that it had no room for dissent, independence, or truth. And as fan investigations grew more intense, new clues surfaced. Real estate records tied to religious nonprofits, footage from retreats where a man matching Kody's description appeared alongside a woman who looked eerily like a blurred figure from Season 16's deleted scenes. And even more chilling were the whispers from ex-members of polygamous sects who began weighing in online, describing eerily similar patterns of behavior from their former patriarchs. Emotional withdrawal, sudden theological pivots, new revelations that conveniently allowed the men more control and secrecy, and most disturbing of all, the spiritual marriages conducted outside legal bounds, framed as holy but designed to sidestep accountability. And Kody, who once claimed to be a reformer, a modern example of loving plural marriage, now seemed like just another man using the language of faith to mask his desire for control. And while the show continued to air, the tone had shifted entirely, from hopeful chaos to hollow conflict, from raw intimacy to careful editing, from authenticity to damage control, and fans began calling it out, flooding forums and comment sections with timelines, theories, and receipts. And many concluded that Elena wasn't just a spiritual wife, she was Kody's escape hatch, the one woman who didn't challenge him, who didn't expect fairness, who didn't share screen time or camera angles or confessionals, because she didn't have to, because she existed outside the system, a system that had clearly failed. And the symbolism was brutal. The wives who gave everything, who built the homes, raised the children, endured the jealousy and loneliness and public exposure, were discarded, while the one who stayed hidden was cherished, protected, prioritized. And whether or not Elena had legal standing didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she had emotional standing, that she had Kody's time, his trust, and likely his future. And with that realization came an unraveling, not just within the family, but within the fandom. because people who had once believed in the premise of sister wives now felt betrayed by it, realizing they had spent years rooting for a man who may have never lived by the principles he preached. And the backlash wasn't quiet. It was loud, swift, and unrelenting as hashtags trended, as former fans shared stories of their own spiritual betrayals, as YouTubers and podcasters dug deeper into the logistics of secret marriages within polygamous circles, and suddenly, the story of Kody and his wives was no longer just a TLC curiosity. It was a cultural case study in power, patriarchy, and the weaponization of religion. And at the center of it all stood a man who refused to answer, a man who once scheduled his life around fairness, but now couldn't be bothered to explain why one woman lived in the shadows while 4 others suffered in the spotlight. And so the wives, though still willing to speak, did what Kody wouldn't. They shared their truths, piece by painful piece, and in doing so, they began to reclaim the narrative. To remind the world that their stories didn't end with Kody's silence, they began with their own voices. And as Christine rebuilt her life in Utah, surrounded by support, self-worth, and authenticity, as Janelle found freedom in speaking the truth, even if it was messy, even if it hurt, and as Mary finally stepped fully into her independence, the legacy of sister wives shifted irreversibly from a man who thought he could control everything to the women who decided they wouldn't let him. And while the wives slowly stepped into their truth, Kody seemed to step further away from his, appearing less and less in family events, growing more erratic in the rare moments he did speak on camera, repeating vague spiritual phrases that now sounded more like shields than revelations, as if he knew that the world was closing in, that the illusion was crumbling, and that no sermon could save him from the consequences of his duplicity. And the more he retreated into silence, the more others filled the void, with adult children stepping forward to share their perspectives, some angry, some heartbroken, some simply confused. And among them, one of the sons made a subtle but pointed remark in an online Q&A, stating that Dad always had his favorites, but now he has his secret. A comment that went viral within the fandom, sparking new waves of speculation and fan-led investigations. And it wasn't long before online detectives uncovered a pattern of financial redirection, suggesting that funds once designated for family living expenses were now being routed to private accounts, possibly even used to support Elena's separate household. And with these revelations, the narrative of spiritual unity officially collapsed, replaced by a darker, more painful story of one man's descent into isolation, control, and emotional abandonment. And still, Kody offered no direct response, as if the truth had become too big to confront, too deeply woven into the fabric of his present, to untangle without destroying everything he still hoped to preserve. And that preservation seemed to center more and more on Elena, a woman still unseen by the public, but now felt everywhere in the gaps. The disappearances, the shifts in Kody's focus and values, and what remained of his spiritual convictions now seemed tailored not to guide a family, but to justify his choices, to make room for a lifestyle that required no sharing, no equality, no difficult conversations, just obedience, silence, and distance. And in that silence, Robyn's role began to twist into something tragic. No longer the favorite wife, but the abandoned second chapter. A woman who had once been promised finality, stability, and closeness, now witnessing her own replacement in real time, unable to fight what she couldn't publicly name. And even in interviews, her tone changed, her confidence cracked, her eyes darted with the weight of secrets too dangerous to say. And fans began to question if Robyn, too, had been deceived, if perhaps she had been kept in the dark about Elena until it was too late, until she was too invested, too implicated, too emotionally entangled to leave, without losing everything she had built around the identity of being Kody's one true wife. And that psychological trap of being both favored and disposable became yet another reflection of how power operates in spiritualized patriarchy, drawing women in with promises of eternal companionship only to reposition them when obedience is no longer enough. And while the show's ratings initially dipped from the family's implosion, they soon resurged as the public fascination with Kody's unraveling took center stage, and with it came renewed scrutiny of TLC's role in all of this, how much they knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to hide. And former crew members, emboldened by the online momentum, began leaking stories of behind-the-scenes tensions, of producers being told to cut certain conversations, of editors ordered to remove scenes where wives questioned Kody's whereabouts, and of one specific shoot in Flagstaff where Kody allegedly stormed off set after being asked about a property deed connected to a shell company, and that shell company, now traced back to a P.O. box linked to a known fundamentalist retreat, became yet another breadcrumb in the trail leading to Elena. And while still no official photo or on-record quote could confirm her identity, the growing body of circumstantial evidence became overwhelming, and even media outlets began cautiously using her name in headlines, no longer asking if she existed, but rather questioning why the show had worked so hard to hide her. And as the curtain continued to lift, a broader conversation began among viewers and former polygamists alike. What happens when the man who claims to speak for God stops listening to anyone else? And the answer played out in real time. Families split, children estranged, women rebuilding from emotional ruin, and a patriarch left with only his silence and the fragile loyalty of a woman the world was never meant to know. And Elena, now the symbol of everything wrong with unchecked spiritual power, became both a ghost and a mirror, reflecting back to each of the original wives the moment they stopped being seen. The moment they were quietly replaced, not just by a person, but by a new belief system entirely. One that no longer required fairness, consent, or love. Only control. And in that revelation came a kind of freedom. Because once the truth was visible, it could no longer be denied, and Christine, Janelle, and even Mary stepped fully into their truth, rejecting the shame that had once kept them compliant, reclaiming their stories, and choosing to no longer be part of a narrative that didn't serve them. And the show, once built on unity, now became a documentary of survival, of women escaping the ideological trap they had once mistaken for divine purpose. And while Kody still refused to admit to a fifth wife, his absence spoke louder than any confirmation could, his actions becoming the confession he would never say out loud. And in that silence, the audience found their answer, not from his mouth but from the broken pieces he left behind. Each one telling a story he tried to bury, and Elena, hidden still, became the final chapter in the story of Sister Wives, not as a woman, but as the moment the myth died. And the truth began. As the shockwaves from Kody's concealed relationship with Elena continued to ripple across every corner of the fractured Brown family, it became painfully clear that what had once been framed as a lifestyle choice rooted in divine principle had evolved, or rather, decayed, into a story of spiritual manipulation and selective loyalty. Because while Christine, Janelle, and Mary worked to rebuild lives no longer dictated by Kody's emotional whims, and Robin attempted to preserve whatever remained of the illusion, the long-term damage was now plainly visible in the children, the silence between former spouses, and the community that once held them up as an example of plural strength. And what made it even more insidious was the way Kody had weaponized spiritual language not to guide, but to deflect accountability, dressing his silence as reverence, his absence as sacrifice, and his betrayal as destiny. And that twisting of language and meaning had left behind a trail of confusion and emotional devastation for nearly 24 children, many of whom now saw through the narrative they were raised in, recognizing that the rules applied to everyone except the man who created them. And in this reckoning came a growing digital archive of first-hand stories, anonymous tips, and behind-the-scenes admissions from people once close to the family, including former spiritual advisors and neighbors, who confirmed that Elena had been introduced in private circles as early as 2016, not as a potential courtship, but as someone Kody referred to as a woman God had chosen for a more sacred bond, a phrase that sent chills through the community, not because of its religious weight, but because of what it implied. That the entire public family had been kept in the dark, while Kody privately pursued and possibly spiritually sealed a new wife without the knowledge or consent of anyone he had promised to love and protect. And this wasn't just betrayal, it was replacement. A deliberate phasing out of the original wives under the guise of spiritual realignment. And as Christine continued to speak publicly, her tone evolved from heartbreak to clarity, stating in one interview that love shouldn't make you disappear, a comment fans immediately linked to Robin's silence and Elena's absence, and Mary, often criticized for her passivity, stunned longtime viewers with a raw live stream in which she admitted she had been mourning a marriage that died long before I was ready to bury it. And Janelle, never one for theatrics, quietly and firmly drew a line, explaining in one clip that she would never again invest in a vision that required her to be invisible. And through these revelations, the Sister Wives audience underwent its own transformation, shifting from passive viewers of polygamous drama to deeply invested witnesses of spiritual trauma, betrayal, and rebirth. And the show, if it could even still be called that, began to resemble a documentary of collapse rather than a portrayal of plural love, with each scene drenched in unspoken truths and layered tension. And Robin, once articulate and composed, now seemed like a woman unraveling in real time, her scripted lines delivered with eyes that no longer aligned with her mouth, her hands fidgeting during scenes where the subject of Kody's time and absence came up. And one moment in particular set the internet ablaze. A clip where Robin, asked if she still believed in polygamy, paused for almost 10 seconds before replying, "I believe in commitment," whatever that looks like. a reply so carefully measured and yet so revealing that fans began splicing it into compilation videos titled "When Robyn Realized She Wasn't the Last." And while all of this might have remained in the realm of emotional fallout, what truly escalated the crisis was the surfacing of documents leaked through an anonymous user claiming to be a former legal consultant for a Flagstaff spiritual group, documents that included land records, financial transfers, and even handwritten vows signed by initials KB and AD, with a spiritual witness named only as Bishop J. And while skeptics attempted to discredit the leak, handwriting analysts and even former Sister Wives producers suggested the signatures matched known samples of Kody's handwriting. And this sparked a media frenzy that TLC could no longer ignore, prompting a damage control press statement that insisted the network was not aware of any off-screen spiritual unions not disclosed by the cast, a statement so vague and lawyerly that it only poured gasoline on the speculation. And from that point forward, the story of Kody's fifth wife broke free from fan circles and entered mainstream culture, covered by podcasts, YouTube channels, think pieces, and national outlets exploring how modern polygamy intersects with media, power, and male privilege. And within that discourse came a new wave of voices, former wives from other polygamist sects who spoke out about similar patterns of control and concealment, where new wives were introduced under secrecy and justified through divine rhetoric, often at the expense of existing wives who were emotionally starved until they voluntarily left, allowing the patriarch to play the victim of abandonment. And that exact pattern, when mapped against the Sister Wives timeline, fit like a key in a lock, with each wife's emotional unraveling corresponding to new sightings of Elena, unexplained financial activity, and Kody's recurring claim that he had lost respect for them, which in retrospect sounded less like spontaneous disappointment and more like strategic withdrawal. And while Kody never publicly named Elena, his behaviors spoke volumes. His increasingly isolated lifestyle, his rants about disloyalty, his sudden obsession with obedience, and his near-total disengagement from his older children, some of whom began sharing cryptic posts of their own, including one particularly damning quote. "It's funny how the man who taught us God was about honesty now lives behind closed doors," a statement that, without naming names, made its point loud and clear, and even more unsettling was the fact that Elena, who had remained entirely silent and invisible, began appearing in background footage. Once as a blurred figure during a market run in a Sister Wives B-roll shot, once as a woman quickly exiting a van on land Kody claimed to have purchased for development, and once, most controversially, in a leaked photo allegedly taken at a religious retreat showing a man embracing a woman in traditional dress who bore an uncanny resemblance to a facial composite created by fans based on descriptions from multiple sources. And while the photo was quickly scrubbed from most platforms, it circulated long enough to raise new alarms, and at the center of it all was Kody, not issuing denials, not offering clarity, but vanishing further into private life while the women he left behind tried to pick up the pieces. And for viewers, the betrayal now felt personal, as if the illusion they'd been sold had crumbled in their own hands, and what had once been a reality show became a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when one man holds all the spiritual keys and uses them not to unlock potential, but to close doors behind him. As the silence from Kody grew more deafening and the wounds within the Brown family deepened, the aftermath of the fifth wife conspiracy shifted from confusion to devastation, leaving no relationship untouched and no belief unshaken. Because now the family wasn't just reeling from betrayal, they were trying to survive the emotional wreckage of a man who had spiritually ghosted them all, and the weight of unspoken truths hung like thick smoke over every conversation, every strained holiday, every attempt at reconciliation. And with the public now fully aware that something massive had been kept off screen, the women left behind could no longer pretend, no longer carry the burden of protecting a man who had not only failed to protect them, but had possibly been constructing their exits for years. And it was Christine, the first to leave, who described the feeling best when she said, "It wasn't like he left one day. It's like he started leaving years before, one small choice at a time." And that quiet erosion of connection, respect, and effort had now metastasized into something even darker. The realization that the life they had built, the sacrifices they had made, the faith they had poured into a system they thought was sacred, had all been leveraged against them to serve a narrative that Kody never truly believed in anymore. And this spiritual dissonance was perhaps most visible in Robyn, who still clung to the identity of the obedient one, but whose actions now looked more like those of a woman caught in a trap, too loyal to leave, too aware to stay silent, too implicated to shift blame elsewhere. And the cracks in her carefully curated persona began to show in interviews, in facial expressions that didn't match her words, in her increasing isolation from the rest of the family, because while the public debate raged about whether Elena was real, whether the marriage had truly happened, those closest to the situation stopped questioning and started mourning. Mourning not just the loss of Kody's presence, but the death of the man they once believed in. And as fans continued to uncover connections between Kody's whereabouts and religious retreats known for patriarchal structures that favored unregistered spiritual unions, more and more people came forward. Former friends, neighbors, even estranged relatives, confirming that Kody had been making references for years to needing to return to his roots, seeking God's deeper covenant, and realigning his household with divine order, all of which, in hindsight, pointed directly to Elena and the secret spiritual system he had built around her. And with that realization, everything the family had struggled to understand suddenly made cruel sense. His sudden harshness, his rants about loyalty, his mysterious disappearances and financial maneuverings, his refusal to attend key family events under vague spiritual pretenses, and his growing intolerance of dissent, all leading to the inevitable collapse of the plural marriage he once preached as God's truth. And as Mary finally spoke candidly in a live stream, her words cut with a clarity that years of repression had previously denied her, saying, "You can't love someone who treats your presence as a problem." A statement that drew widespread support from fans who had watched her endure emotional exile for years. And Janelle, too, grew sharper, more emboldened, speaking out not only about emotional abandonment, but financial betrayal, implying in one confessional that shared resources were no longer being shared equally. And though she didn't name Elena, she didn't have to. The implications were clear, and the pain, now visible across every social media platform and episode, became the unspoken evidence of a truth Kody refused to confront. And even TLC, once so careful to protect its talent, began shifting the show's focus, allowing the women more space to speak unfiltered, removing the glossy editing that had once softened Kody's worst moments, and in doing so, exposed a man who no longer resembled the leader he claimed to be. And what remained was a shell of spiritual authority, hollowed out by ego, fear, and the desperate desire to control something, anything, after losing the respect of nearly everyone he once held closest. And as public interest surged, so did media scrutiny, with podcasts, YouTube exposés, and articles dissecting Kody's every move. And in one viral clip, a former assistant producer described how multiple scenes showing Kody's absences or wife confrontations were edited down or cut entirely at the request of higher-ups, reinforcing the suspicion that the fifth wife narrative had been managed behind the scenes for years. And once those stories surfaced, fans took it upon themselves to connect the dots, creating detailed visual timelines of Kody's unexplained travel days, matching them to reports of spiritual gatherings, off-grid real estate transfers, and the rare blurry sightings of the woman many now believe to be Elena. And in those timelines, the truth didn't just emerge, it screamed, pointing to a years-long deception built not out of necessity, but out of willful avoidance. A spiritual pivot designed not for divine alignment, but personal preference. And as Christine's daughters began speaking out more boldly, revealing how they had watched their mother cry behind closed doors for years, how they had seen the difference between the father he was for Robin's children and the ghost he became for everyone else. The story stopped being about wives and started being about children who grew up believing in a family structure that ultimately left them abandoned, confused, and forced to untangle spiritual trauma in public view. And yet, through that pain came a strange kind of empowerment, as each former wife began to build a new life outside the confines of the system that had once defined them, showing their daughters and sons what strength looked like when it wasn't filtered through obedience. And perhaps that's what scared Kody the most. Not just the exposure of his secret, but the fact that the women he once led were now leading their own lives without fear. And in the absence of Elena's voice, it was their voices that shaped the legacy, not just of the show, but of the man who thought he could rewrite reality through silence, secrecy, and spiritual spin. The emotional manipulation masked as revelation, it became clear that the true legacy of Sister Wives would not be about plural marriage or celestial unions, but about the slow, painful consequences of unchecked power disguised as spiritual leadership. And the most damning part of all was that Kody had every opportunity to turn things around, to face the discomfort, to admit the truth, to honor the women and children who had followed him through faith. But instead, he chose to double down on secrecy, isolating himself with Elena, whose silence and invisibility became both weapon and shield, protecting him from confrontation while severing every remaining tie to the people who had once given him everything. And while the rumors of a child with Elena could never be confirmed, the implications alone were enough to scorch what little trust remained. especially for the children he had neglected in favor of a life they were never allowed to ask questions about. And the emotional toll of that abandonment came through not in dramatic scenes, but in quiet, devastating moments. Janelle sitting alone in a chair meant for two, Christine brushing past a framed wedding photo that once meant everything, Robin's forced tears in interviews that no longer convinced anyone of anything but fear, and Mary, whose voice had once trembled, now steady, now clear, now final, saying, "You don't need closure from someone who never showed up in the first place." And those words, more than any tabloid headline or leaked document, told the real story of Kody's fifth marriage, that it wasn't about polygamy or spiritual callings or divine order, but about one man's slow descent into the kind of isolation that only comes when you've burned every bridge and called the ashes holy. And in the years that followed, the world moved on, the headlines faded. The show lost its shine, but the wounds remained, carried quietly by the daughters who wondered if they were ever enough, by the sons who learned that love must be earned, by the women who rebuilt from scratch with nothing but truth and resilience, and by the fans who watched in disbelief as the story turned from curiosity to cautionary tale. And yet, in that wreckage, there was something powerful, something pure, something true, because the story didn't end with Kody. It ended with the ones who chose to walk away, who chose self-worth over submission, who chose freedom over fantasy. And as Christine found new love on her own terms, as Janelle built a life rooted in clarity and strength, as Mary finally looked into the camera without fear, and as Robin faded into the background, no longer the center, no longer the final wife, but a woman quietly reckoning with everything she lost to keep a man who was never really there. The truth of Sister Wives was finally told, not by production, not by press, but by the voices of women who once believed and now knew better. And in the end, Elena remained unseen, untouched by public opinion, protected by layers of secrecy and spiritual rhetoric. But her presence, her role, her impact, those could never be erased. And while she may never step forward, while her side may never be told, it didn't matter, because the damage was already done, the silence already spoken, and the truth already lived by those left behind. And in that truth, there was a final, devastating irony that the man who once preached family above all else had built a life where no one was left beside him, only behind him, watching, remembering, and finally moving on. And even as the cameras shut off, as the headlines cooled and the world seemed to move on, the emotional debris left behind by Kody's hidden fifth marriage only grew heavier, more complex, and more permanent in the lives of those who had once called themselves sister wives. Because the true consequences of a broken legacy rarely arrive in a single explosive moment. They settle in slowly, like dust over everything, making it hard to see clearly at first, then impossible to ignore. And that was the space the Brown family now occupied. A post-Kody landscape where trust had been shattered, spiritual certainty had dissolved into resentment, and the quiet echo of abandonment rang louder than any sermon he had ever preached. And while Kody slipped further into obscurity, clinging to a private existence shielded by spiritual rhetoric and surrounded by rumors of Elena's continued presence, the women he left behind were not afforded the luxury of vanishing. They had to live publicly with the mess, with the pain, with the haunting realization that the man they built their lives around had long since left them emotionally, even as he appeared beside them physically on screen. And for Christine, every day spent rebuilding wasn't just about independence. It was about emotional detox, about relearning self-worth in the absence of control. And she often described the healing as uneven, moments of empowerment colliding with memories that still bruised her spirit. And Janelle, ever the realist, found herself doing math, not just with finances, but with timelines, calculating how long she had lived half-seen, how often she had silenced her instincts, how deeply she had trusted a man who had chosen secrecy over unity. And Mary, once framed as the most broken, now emerged with a fire that caught many by surprise, because in the wake of betrayal, she had chosen to confront her own complicity in the silence, to face the years she had spent waiting, hoping, rationalizing, and instead began creating boundaries so thick, so deliberate, that even the suggestion of reconciliation was off the table. And as for Robin, the once favored wife who had seemingly won the battle for Kody's attention, the irony was almost cruel, because her victory came wrapped in isolation, secrecy, and increasing public distrust, as the narrative shifted away from sisterhood and into a cautionary tale about the cost of being chosen in a system where women were always expected to compete. And as she clung to whatever remained of her spiritual justification, viewers saw the cracks grow deeper, interviews where her eyes filled with tears, but her answers lacked conviction, moments where she seemed to be pleading not with the audience, but with herself. To believe that this was still God's plan, still sacred, still worth the wait, even as the man she had aligned herself with had slowly vanished into a new life no one else was allowed to access. And in that life, Elena became more than a woman. She became a symbol of every broken promise, every withheld truth, every moment Kody had chosen comfort over courage, and the mystery that once shielded her identity now amplified her impact. Because in being unseen, she became undeniable. And as more fan investigations surfaced, matching Kody's off-grid movements with rare sightings, voice recordings, and spiritual retreat guest lists, the evidence transformed into a kind of spiritual reckoning, not just for the Browns, but for the viewers who had followed them for over a decade, who now found themselves rethinking everything they had once admired. And the broader conversation shifted from individual betrayal to systemic critique, how spiritual frameworks built around male authority often create blind spots, emotional casualties, and long-term damage that cannot be undone with apologies or edited episodes. And in that discourse, the wives were no longer just characters. They were case studies, women who had lived under a system that punished questions and rewarded submission until one by one, they stepped outside of it, and in doing so, rewrote the ending for themselves and for their children. Who had grown up watching the dynamic unfold in real time, the damage was just beginning to surface. Sons who no longer spoke to their father, daughters who expressed anger at how their mothers had been treated, adult children who publicly acknowledged the unequal love and attention they received based on which mother they belonged to. And perhaps most devastating of all were the questions they couldn't answer. Why didn't he fight for them? Why did he disappear when they needed him most? Why did the man who taught them to follow God abandon the very principles he claimed to defend? And those questions hung over every reunion, every holiday gathering that felt smaller, colder, incomplete. And even the show itself struggled to maintain coherence, now reduced to montages of awkward silences, evasive answers, and women trying to find meaning in a structure that no longer existed. And yet, through that discomfort came something transformative, not just escape, but emancipation, not just endings, but beginnings. Because Christine found love again, not the kind that needed to be shared or approved by anyone else, but one that affirmed her value without condition. And Janelle built her own financial independence, refusing to be entangled in anything she hadn't personally agreed to. And Mary, long overlooked, long misunderstood, began building a platform of her own, rooted in transparency and accountability, not in spite of her pain, but because of it. And while Robin remained with Kody, her absence from the public sphere became its own kind of confession, a quiet acknowledgement that the story she had once helped sell could no longer withstand the weight of the truth. And that truth, now echoed by millions, was simple. You cannot build a life on half-truths and expect it to hold. And while Kody may never speak the words the world wants to hear, while Elena may never show her face, while TLC may never release the full footage of what really happened, the story has already been told through the tears, the exits, the silence, the revelations, and most of all, through the women who refused to let their pain be the end of their story, and instead chose to turn the final chapter into a beginning,